So I was just having a walk around my UK tropical style garden and looking at some of the shady borders, and I just thought to myself, how good is some of the foliage on some of these shady plants that we can grow in our climate. So I thought I'd do a little video on some of my favourite ones in the garden that we can pretty much grow all year round. So the first plant I'm going to talk about, and I have spoke about it a lot because it's one of my utter favourites in the garden, and this is Fatsy Polycarpa, and this is the Edward Needham form strain. If you grow Fatsy Polycarpa green fingers, it's pretty much the same plant. The Needham form is basically a seed grown plant, whereas the green fingers is its sort of more commercial name, where it's been put through tissue culture. As far as I'm aware, I do believe that, and I've said this before, that the seed grown Needham form is a better plant. I feel like, you know, it just grows so much better for me than the green fingers that I've had. That's not to say the green fingers isn't a good plant. For some people it does really well. I know that there's a few people that have struggled out there, but to think that this is hardy, evergreen, and can pretty much look good most of the year round, there isn't many other plants that do it for me the way that this does. And for its sort of just pure sculptural shape to it, I find that it does much better with a bit more shade. I have two others in the garden, a lot larger one than this, and what happens is the leaves tend to curl up a bit when it gets too much sun. So I would definitely say this is one of the best plants out there for that wow factor in a shady border. I'll put a couple of clips of my other two on as well, because I do like to repeat plant in my garden. I think it creates balance throughout the borders, even if they're sort of not right near each other, but it just brings easy for me to say, I'm going to give that up, familiarity, that's the word I'm after, right? And it just brings that all-round balance. So sometimes it's worth having two or three in the garden in various spots just to tie it all in. Now I've grown these from seed, and they do come true from seed. I do have a small one down here, if I can show you, and you can see here a little bit, this tends to what happens, they curl a little bit if they get too much sun. This was in quite a bright place in my greenhouse, but glorious looking plant that just wants to grow away. So you might not be able to get the Edward Needham strain or form, however it's called, but you should have just the same sort of impact and look if you can grow the Fatsy Polycarpa green fingers. Right, so next I'm going to talk about this fern, which I'm using for ground cover in this same border. So there's a few plants in here, all group planted, which I highly recommend for anyone that's creating a shady border, or any border really. Repeat plant, group plant, I can't mention it enough because I think it really adds to the overall look. But this fern is, if I pronounce it correctly, Polystrium Polyblepharum, and this is about probably the size it grows. It may get bigger, I'm not too sure, I've had it in a few years. But the reason I love this fern, not just its foliage and the colour and its form, but it looks good for so long in the year. When the other ferns, so for instance I've got others in the border like that over to the left, they tend to look quite tatty at the end of the year, and you have to cut them all back in spring. Now I'm not saying that you might not have to tidy this plant up, but it just looks so good for so much longer. Now I've group planted it here, and because I love it so much, around the other side, I'll show you in a minute, I have put some more in, but I have spread them more about, so it gives me a slightly different look, whereas I've used these at the front of the border. I'll show you the others round on the other path. So round here I've used them, and these are a lot smaller because I've put them in recently, but I've spread them more out. I haven't used them at the front of the border. Excuse my very eaten Brachiops fatsoides, thank you slugs. I've basically used them and spread them throughout the border but further back, and the reason I've done that is because as this Brachiops, and I've also got this Nandina here, as they grow up I can still see through the leaves of these plants, and I'll still see under the sort of canopy of them. So I've used these as ground cover but further back in this situation, and there's quite a few in here, and they should eventually cover most of that soil. And I think there's probably all in all maybe about 5 or 6 plants in there through the border, and they're going to look good nearly all year round. So if I walk through here in sort of autumn, you know, early spring, I'm hoping that rather than see soil, I'm still going to see the lovely foliage on this fern. So that is why I highly recommend Polystrium Polyblepharum. This is the next plant on my list, and this is by far, and I've mentioned it before, my favourite Persicaria, and it is Persicaria Virginiana Variegata. So this is in a slightly brighter spot. It isn't as shady as the other. I think sort of dappled shade is sort of probably somewhere in between, or maybe it gets early sun or late sun. But generally with white variegated plants, you try to not give them as much sunlight because it can brown them or make them look discoloured. So finding these spots that are sort of somewhere in between, that are really bright but they're not going to get that massive amount of direct sun, and then you get some real colouring on this foliage. And like I say, it's cut back sort of every year, but then regrows like the other Persicarias. Doesn't get as tall as, it will get taller than this, but it doesn't get as tall as say the red dragons and Persicaria like that. It's quite well behaved, it doesn't spread too much. So I've been told by a nursery owner that it does come true from seed, so I'm really hoping that I can get some seed off it and grow a few more of these plants. I found it a little bit trickier from cuttings than other Persicarias like Red Dragon, which you could basically just put in a piece of water and it will root. I have found this one a bit trickier, but absolutely, if you can get hold of it, it just gives you such a good contrast. And if you was to plant it, for instance, next to, you know, them sort of Polystrium ferns or something really dark green, it's just going to contrast so well. Now another plant that's very similar to this, and I will mention it just so there's no confusion, and I've got one here and I'll bring it next to you, is this one. And if you look at it, it's very much the same. I was going to try and get the name in the shop, but I don't think I need to, so let me put it next to it. So this is also a variegated one, and this one is Persicaria Painter's Palette, and if you can see, it's also got variegation in the leaf, and it also has these like chevron or batwing type sort of pattern to it. So that's also a very, very nice Persicaria, and I thought I'd mention it so you could see the difference, and having them side by side, obviously this is a smaller plant, but having them side by side can give you a good idea. And I would also say this is a really nice plant as well, but for that little bit of wow, I just find the Virginiana Variegata Persicaria a little bit more special. So if you can get hold of it, well worth growing. So the next hardy shade loving plant I'm going to talk about is this one, and what a stunning, unusual leaf for any type of garden, but in a tropical style garden it looks absolutely fantastic. Now this one is in a pot, because, and I'm showing this one because the ones that are in my border are a lot smaller and are a bit behind, so this is probably my best example. And this is Sauromatum Venosum. I think it's also known as the voodoo lily. It's a bulbous aroid, like sort of woodland conditions. It is hardy, but you do need to give it free draining soil. So you know, add some compost with grit and stuff like that to make it a really enriched soil, because it loves that sort of type of soil, but it does need to be free draining. And if you can do that, you may want to mulch, but they should come back hopefully every year. And you know, imagine a bunch of these leaves. I'll show a couple of little bits of footage of some in the garden, and also there is another version of this which is Sauromatum Venosum Indian Giant, and I'll show the two side by side in a bit of footage. The Indian Giant has much broader, larger leaves on it, and if you can get hold of that, it's probably well worth your growing and should be just as hardy. Plants like this, for anyone coming to visit your garden, is something that they just don't see every day. It is so unusual, but not that hard to get hold of. Lots of nurseries should be selling it online. If you're finding these plant nurseries that sell these sort of more rare or unusual plants, it should be easier to get hold of. Like I say, like the other plants I've shown, hardy. Obviously this dies back for winter. It does produce a flower sort of earlier spring, bit and typical arum type flower. But if you can get hold of this one and the Indian Giant, which you should be able to, next year plant a few in some free draining shady soil, and yeah, brilliant. So the next plant I want to cover, especially for dramatic foliage, is this, and this one's in a pot, but will be fine in the ground in shady conditions as long as it is sort of damp. It should do really well for you, and this is Rodgersia Crug's Colossus. And as you can see, it's in a pot, but there is new smaller leaves coming up through, and it will create like a colony. I'll show some footage from Jersey Cottage Nursery's shade tunnel where you can see this and what it looks like. Group, you know, a big group planted of it, and its foliage when it first comes out is sort of a I don't know, bronzy colour, I suppose. So that spring colour should be really sort of quite dramatic, and the leaf size, you know, is going to really sort of stand out in any garden. I can't wait till next year, find a spot in my border. It's probably going to go somewhere into this space, because I want them big dramatic leaves, and I can't wait till it groups right up. Looking forward to that so much. I would say that most Rodgersias look really good, so, and would add lots of shape and form to your garden, but sometimes you've got to go that next step and find them ones that look even more dramatic. If you're going to grow a Rodgersia, why not grow pretty much one of the best ones there? And for me, that is Crug's Colossus. So there's lots of others that I could have mentioned, from Brassioopsis to Scheffleras and the like, which give that brilliant all year round structural interest, or do something really good for your garden and give it that little bit more wow factor. If there's any you can think of, please leave it in the comments. I love this type of gardening. I love to hear what you're saying, and thank you very much for watching.